When the Metropolitan Museum of Art transferred 11 papyrus fragments to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in November 1967, the first presidency, David O. McKay presiding, sent a letter to the scholar who'd brokered the transfer. They told him the fragments support completely the claim made by the prophet Joseph Smith. That letter was written before any serious Egyptological analysis had been done.
Within months, the analysis came back. The fragments were a standard Egyptian funerary text prepared for a man named Hor. His name's on them. Egyptologists knew exactly what they were. Nothing in them mentions Abraham. Nothing in them corresponds to the Book of Abraham at any point.
The first presidency's letter is still in the historical record. The Egyptologists' conclusions are still in the historical record. The essay that tries to account for both of those things at the same time is on the church's website right now.
Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups. We're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem. Digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time.
We explore everything from the church's cultural weirdness and doctrinal whiplash to the deep wounds of religious trauma, Mormon crime, and the messy, glorious road to recovery.
Whether you're freshly out, years removed, or just Exmo curious, this is the right place. We're here to hold space, spill tea, and call out the culty stuff hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, Jess.
And I'm Hannah.
This is episode 2 of our 8-episode series on the gospel topic essays, the documents the church quietly published beginning in 2013, approved by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12, that address the most historically contested questions about LDS history and doctrine. In episode 1, we looked at what the Book of Mormon translation essay admits about the seer stone and the hat. Today, we're in the Book of Abraham, and this one is different from the others because the evidence here is physical. It survived, and you can look at it.
The Book of Mormon translation problem is significant, but obviously the gold plates were whisked back up to heaven. They no longer exist, and they're not here to examine. The Book of Abraham problem, it's different because there is a document. Joseph Smith translated directly from it, and it exists. Egyptologists have studied these fragments. They've read them, and the church's own essay acknowledges what they have found.
The Gospel Topics essay on the Book of Abraham is titled Translation and Historicity of the Book of Abraham. It was published in July 2014. We're going to read it closely today, not just for what it admits, but for how it's written, because the how matters as much as the what.
The powerful truths found in the Book of Abraham emerged from a set of unique historical events. In the summer of 1835, an entrepreneur named Michael Chandler arrived at church headquarters in Kirtland, Ohio, with 4 mummies and multiple scrolls of papyrus. Chandler found a ready audience. Partly due to the exploits of the French Emperor Napoleon, the antiquities unearthed in the catacombs of Egypt had created a fascination across the Western world. Chandler capitalized on this interest by touring with ancient Egyptian artifacts and charging visitors a fee to see them. These artifacts had been uncovered by Antonio Lobolo, a former cavalryman in the Italian army. Lobolo, who oversaw some of the excavations for the Consul General of France, pulled 11 mummies from a tomb not far from the ancient city of Thebes. Lobolo shipped the artifacts to Italy, and after his death, they ended up in New York. At some point, the mummies and scrolls came into Chandler's possession. By the time the collection arrived in Kirtland, all but 4 mummies and several papyrus scrolls had already been sold. A group of Latter-day Saints in Kirtland purchased the remaining artifacts for the church. After Joseph Smith examined the papyri and commenced the translation of some of the characters or hieroglyphics, his history recounts, much to our joy, we found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham. And from there was born the Book of Abraham. Thus says the gospel topic essays on the subject. That is how the church introduces the origins of the Book of Abraham, which was then published serially as a translation in the church's Times and Seasons newspaper beginning in 1842, and then it was canonized in the Pearl of Great Price as part of the standard works. In 2026, the Come Follow Me curriculum covers it in January and February as part of the Old Testament rotation, and the lessons teach the pre-existence, the council in heaven, and the covenant with Abraham as straightforwardly as they teach anything else like creation or the flood.
The Book of Abraham isn't something the church can quietly set aside. The theology that flows from it, the preexistence, the plurality of gods, the council in heaven, the doctrine that humans can become divine, this is what makes LDS theology categorically distinct. It's not peripheral, it's load bearing. Which means the institution isn't just defending a text, it's defending the doctrinal architecture that the text made possible. You can't say the papyri don't match and also say nothing important follows from that. The church knows this. That's why the essay exists. And that's what we're going to take apart.
The claim underneath all of this is a specific physical claim, because Joseph didn't say in this context that he had received a vision. No, this ancient document found its way into his hands and he translated it. The papyri were the source, and Abraham had written on them. Joseph read what Abraham wrote. When church leaders described the Book of Abraham in General Conference, they were consistent that this is translated by the prophet Joseph Smith from the papyrus record taken from the catacombs of Egypt. And that is just the official language in the church materials for over a century. It is describing a direct relationship between the physical objects and the text. It calls it a translation like 100 million times.
But that claim is checkable, right? After 54 years before the papyri were even rediscovered, someone checked it. An Episcopal bishop named Franklin Spalding sent copies of the 3 facsimiles, Joseph's own published illustrations included in the canonized text. He sent them to 8 of the world's leading Egyptologists and Semitists and asked each for an independent assessment. All 8, working independently, concluded the facsimiles were standard Egyptian funerary documents with no connection to Abraham. And the results were published in 1912 and covered in the New York Times. The church had access to that conclusion from the day it was printed.
Can I just say, though, that speaks to the truth of the Book of Abraham? Because it just goes to show how hard Satan has to work.
It's like the fossil record. It's just here to confuse you. Not
If
to
it wasn't
document
true, why would Satan
creatures.
have to get into those wicked men's heads, right? To have them spread lies and falsehoods about the church? Why would he bother?
I know.
Why would he bother?
Just
wouldn't. He would
wants
just leave
you
it
to
alone.
reinforce your faith by
Right?
seeing these things. And
So just know that the more false it seems,
Wrap-
it's actually proof that the more true it is.
oh, that's,
Okay?
I got it. Agreed.
Okay, so now you know what it was like growing up in my house.
Random way.
I'm serious.
Mine too,
so
to an extent.
serious.
Yes.
It's like, okay, noted. Mental gymnastics, go gadget. Okay, got it. So the church sat with the knowledge that what they purported to have was not what they had for 54 years before the papyri themselves resurfaced. I say resurfaced because their existence was known about, but their location wasn't. It's not that the church did not know that this scholarly opinion was out there. It's that they knew what the scholarly opinion said, and they made a decision about what to do with it. When the papyri were rediscovered in 1966, the question the institution was facing wasn't whether the scholars had been right in 1912. It was how much worse is the physical evidence surfacing going to make it for them.
The papyri were believed to have been destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and most of them probably were. After Joseph Smith's death, the collection passed to his family, was sold, changed hands, and then some of it ended up in a museum in Chicago that burned. What wasn't known, and what the church didn't know, was that a portion of the collection had been acquired separately and had ended up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where it sat in their Egyptian collection for 20 years before anyone thought to mention it to the church. In May 1966, the Met's curator approached a visiting Coptic scholar named Aziz Atiya from the University of Utah and asked him to act as intermediary. They had 11 papyrus fragments. They'd been sitting there since 1947, acquired from the estate of the man who'd bought the original collection from Joseph Smith's widow, Emma. The museum knew what they had. They asked Atiya if the church would want them back. The fragments were formally transferred to the church on November 27, 1967. The first presidency wrote immediately that they supported Joseph's claims completely. Then the Egyptologists examined them.
Multiple scholars not coordinating with each other at multiple institutions, and what they found was the truth, which is that the papyri are a standard Egyptian funerary text called the Book of Breathings. This one was owned by a man named Hor. His name is on it, so we know it was his. It accompanied him to the afterlife, and it has nothing to do with the Book of Abraham, remotely, in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so how is the church going to handle this in their essay? Let's look at how they use words. It's no wonder that so many of the apostles were lawyers. No wonder at all. The gospel topic essay states that Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham. And I just want to say that actually just characterizing it as fragments is apparently quite a stretch, because it creates an image of just little snippets here and there.
Scraps of paper.
Scraps, exactly. And that's because if you just have scraps, well, it makes sense that this piece doesn't match and that piece doesn't match. Here a piece, there a piece, none of the pieces match. So much has been destroyed, but that's also not the case. So even just labeling it fragments is not quite true. The church is doing the most to do the most for their claims, right? They are desperately holding on to the consensus of the scholarly community, including their own scholars who frankly just do not count, and telling you, look, we get it, the papyri don't match. So keep that in your head, because we'll come back to what the essay is going to do with that fact.
Yeah, we will. Robert Ritner, the Rowe Professor of Egyptology at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, one of the foremost Egyptologists of his generation, wrote a formal response to the essay when it was published in 2014. His conclusion was what the Book of Abraham is a perhaps well-meaning but erroneous invention by Joseph Smith. He wasn't a critic with an axe to grind. He was the field's expert, reading the field's evidence and giving it the name it had earned. He died in 2021. The essay remains on the website unchanged.
Yeah, exactly. Robert Ritner wasn't a Mormon critic by background. So anybody who wants to point to him as like an anti-Mormon, no, he was a career Egyptologist whose specialty was Egyptian religious texts, precisely the category that Joseph Smith Papyri belonged to. He, of all people, was qualified to say what was or was not on those documents. His multi-part interview with John Dehlin and Radio Free Mormons on Mormon Stories podcast is highly illuminating about this whole history. It's well worth a listen, but it's 13 hours long altogether. The Book of Abraham includes 3 drawings, facsimiles copied directly from the papyri, and naturally Joseph helpfully provided detailed labels explaining what each figure represented. And if you were listening only right now while you're doing other things, this might be the time that you want to stop and look at the screen to see what we are talking about. In the first picture, facsimile 1, Joseph Smith explained that this was Abraham lying on an altar. The idolatrous priest of Elkanah standing over him, knife raised, about to offer him as a sacrifice. But what Joseph claimed was Abraham being sacrificed by an Egyptian priest is actually Osiris on a funerary lion bed tended by the jackal-headed god Anubis. The altar is a standard funerary bed found on thousands of Egyptian artifacts. The 4 idolatrous gods are the well-known 4 sons of Horus in their canopic jars. with the little heads, the deity heads, whose actual Egyptian names I would absolutely mangle if I
Slaughter.
attempted to try. I won't. It would be funny, but we don't have the time. Obviously, they're nowhere in Joseph's interpretation. So the broken areas of the papyrus, you can see where there are missing fragments, were reconstructed incorrectly. And in fact, that was how...
Azizatia.
So he immediately recognized them as the missing papyrus of Joseph Smith's because of the penciled in missing pieces. That's how he instantly recognized it as what it was, because the missing pieces, the jackal head of Anubis, the god, always represented with a jackal head, but Joseph Smith wasn't to know that, and he had replaced it with a human head. And then a knife had been drawn where no knife exists in the original texts. On the lead plate used to print Facsimile 3, you can actually see where Anubis's snout was physically chiseled off to make him appear human. And that's really interesting.
Not a counterfeit. There's no counterfeiting going on here. Sorry.
It's
So
depressing.
obvious.
Yeah.
It's so depressing, though.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like, what do you do with that?
Okay, come on, people. Yeah. Anyways. So facsimile 2 is the hypocephalus. This circular document was never part of any scroll. It belonged to a different mummy named Shashank. Missing sections were filled in by copy-pasting images from a completely different papyrus. So Joseph's interpretation of Kolab as the nearest star to God's throne is simply the Hebrew root for center, applied to the center of the circle. And his Egyptian words, which I will try and pronounce, but they're going to get mangled, like Obelish, Enish, Goan, Dosh, etc., they're just gibberish with no Egyptian meaning.
Exactly. Can you mangle it if it isn't a word anyway?
If it's gibberish to start with?
Yeah. It's like, oh, this is going to sound like gibberish. Because it is.
It is. And the God that he calls God on his throne is actually the creator god Min Ammon, depicted in the act of creation by masturbation. The 4 sons of Horus, which he translates as representing the earth in its 4 quarters, are not directional symbols. They are protective spirits for the dead.
Finally, the third facsimile, the scene Joseph describes as Abraham teaching astronomy to Pharaoh's court, is the standard concluding vignette of the Book of Breathings, the deceased priest Hor being welcomed into Osiris's presence after passing the weighing of the heart. Pharaoh is actually the goddess Isis. The slave Olimla is Anubis. The hieroglyphs above the figures' heads, which Joseph claimed to translate, were legible and say nothing resembling his translations.
And Joseph didn't claim a general impression of the document. He labeled specific figures with specific identities and a specific narrative. Those labels are wrong in ways that are fully checkable because Egyptology is a real field. These are not obscure documents. Facsimile 1 has parallels in dozens of surviving papyri. The scene has a name. It has a known function. It has a known cast of figures. Joseph got every single one of them wrong. We're going to need that fact in a moment because the church's explanation for how the Book of Abraham was produced has a problem with it, a very specific problem.
You know, we laugh, and we do laugh about this because it's nonsense, but I'm serious undergirding this. There is a lot of grief and trauma for me because I was raised in the church, but it wasn't like the Book of Abraham meant anything to me. However, if you had said to me, where does the concept of the 3 degrees of heaven come from? I'd be like, I don't know, the scriptures. Which scriptures? I don't know. Bible, I guess. But, I just wouldn't have I didn't know the significance of the Book of Abraham. I didn't know its origins. I didn't know, as you said, how sort of load-bearing it is in Mormon theology. Cut to me just stumbling on a website in 2006 called 10 Problems with Mormonism. They were sort of the most 10 common shelf items, I would say. And right up there was the Book of Abraham. And I was just kind of like, ooh, what's this? The church's worst nightmare, right? A curious internet explorer clicking on problems with the Book of Abraham. So for me, what was really significant about learning this was that unlike everything else, it was oh, this is a game changer. right? This changes everything. This is like going from suspecting that your husband might be cheating to walking in and finding him banging the neighbor over the table. Like,
Ouch.
like there's no denying
No
it.
going back.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. So for me, it became a real struggle with sort of like, how can my parents be my parents and also be so committed to willful ignorance around this?
So it's tough. And it's not just this, right? There are other things that you can point to. It's not just these quote unquote translations.
Yeah. So speaking of translations and more issues with them, related to the Book of Abraham, there's also these documents called the Egyptian alphabet and grammar documents, or sometimes called the Kirtland papers. In the summer of 1835, Joseph was continually engaged, according to his journal, in translating an alphabet to the Book of Abraham and arranging the grammar of the Egyptian language as practiced by the ancients. Close quote. So these working documents, these Kirtland papers, were held by the church for over a century and not made fully public until very recently, and they show Joseph's translation process directly. You've got the Egyptian hieratic characters, they're placed in the left margin, and we have an image of this. Paragraphs of the Book of Abraham appear immediately to the right, and multiple scribes copied this format repeatedly. Warren Parrish was one of those scribes, and he explicitly described the process. He said, he sat beside Joseph and penned down the translation as he claimed to receive it by direct inspiration of heaven. Close quote. So the characters in the margins can be matched directly to surviving lines of the actual papyrus. And they represent a few fragments of Egyptian words like lake, great, the water, I think, was one of them, each expanded into entire paragraphs of scripture, according to Joseph. So he was taking these individual hieratic signs and dictating lengthy English text as their translation, which Robert Ritner points out was consistent with the thinking of his time, that he thought that tiny fragments of Egyptian text had encoded immense meaning within one hieroglyphic. The gospel topic essays say that neither the rules nor the translations of the grammar book correspond to those recognized by Egyptologists today, close quote, or any day, I would add. Never has there been a day, not today, any day.
Never.
As I said, the church had been holding on to these documents for over a century, while you scholars had found the manuscripts in the church vault in 1933, examined them, and then left them there. And they stayed there until Gerald and Sandra Tanner published them in 1966.
The grammar documents matter for a specific reason. They showed Joseph actively trying to build a system for decoding Egyptian characters. You don't construct a grammar for a language if the translation process has nothing to do with the characters on the page. The grammar manuscripts are evidence of Joseph genuinely attempting to read the papyri, matching symbols to meanings. But the system he built doesn't work. Every Egyptian character he assigned a meaning to means something else entirely. And that matters because of what comes next, because the church's current explanation for the Book of Abraham depends on a very particular claim about how the translation happened. And the grammar documents, they're a problem for that claim.
You think?
So the essay offers three possible explanations for why the papyri don't match the Book of Abraham, and it presents them without endorsing any of them. It lays them out and then steps back. This is the most important structural feature of the essay, not what it argues, but what it declines to conclude. Now, the first is the missing scroll theory. The surviving fragments, the ones at the Met, the ones Egyptologists identified as the Book of Breathings, are not the papyri Joseph used. There was another scroll, a longer one. It contained the actual writings of Abraham, and that scroll was destroyed in the Chicago fire.
As I said, the church using the word fragments, only fragments of the papyri survive today, is designed to create an impression that most of the evidence is gone, when in reality, Egyptologists believe that they know fairly well what those papyri contained, namely those standard funerary texts rather than Abraham's writing. The essay then claims that the relationship between the Papyri and the Book of Abraham is not known. This contradicts Joseph Smith himself, who explicitly claimed a direct relationship between the Egyptian characters and Abraham's writings.
The second explanation they give is the catalyst theory, and this is where the essay puts most of its weight and where the argument falls apart most completely. The catalyst theory says that the papyri weren't the source text. They were instead a physical prompt. Joseph looked at them, and then God revealed the Book of Abraham to his mind. The essay puts it this way, quote, Joseph's study of the papyri may have led to a revelation about key events and teachings in the life of Abraham, much as he had earlier received a revelation about the life of Moses while studying the Bible, end quote. That sentence is proposing a model of revelation by proximity that, if accepted, applies to everything Joseph ever claimed to translate. You look at an object, God fills in the rest. The object's actual content is just beside the point.
And what the essay just plainly avoids stating is what Joseph Smith originally claimed, that the papyri were literally, quote, the writings of Abraham written by his own hand upon papyrus, close quote. This is just a deliberate softening of the original historical claims. Has to be. The problem with taking the position that the papyri merely catalyzed a separate revelation rather than being translated is, among other things, just among other things, that it requires believing that Joseph Smith sat with scribes, described the characters, had paragraphs of text written next to them as translations, called them literal translations, signed his name to them as literal translations, created a document called Valuable Discoveries of Hidden Documents or something, was witnessed by all these people doing it, while being unaware that he was actually receiving revelation rather than translating. So we have to believe that Joseph believed he was translating Egyptian when he wasn't, because he said he was. Or so he's a fucking liar.
Well,
either he's right. I mean, all of it, right? So the catalyst theory requires a God who, for no apparent reason, deceives his own prophet. He didn't have to. He could have just given him the correct documents. Give him the correct documents. Don't make it so implausible.
Why does Heavenly Father make it so hard?
Because I guess the more implausible you make it, the more true it is. No, just kidding.
Again, circling back to that earlier.
Right, because you have to be more faithful. Mm-hmm. That will mean only the very elect will remain faithful in the last days.
Yeah. So the grammar documents make it worse. Joseph wasn't glancing at the papyri as a passive prompt. He was sitting with them, assigning English meanings to specific Egyptian characters, building what he described as a grammar of the Egyptian language. So if the translation was purely revelatory, the papyri just an object in the room, then there was no reason to do that work. The grammar documents show Joseph treating this as a language he was actively trying to decode, and of course, decoding wrong. I have to marvel. I mean, as you said, Hannah, it's no wonder so many in the first presidency and the quorum are attorneys, right? The way that they were able to craft this narrative that gives people who are desperately wanting to cling to something that is plausible, to something to say, well, see, I knew. It's like it's the people that are the problem, not the church. The church is perfect, the man isn't. And I've heard those words from my own mother. I mean, it's astounding. And also, I mean, I'm kind of frankly impressed.
Right. I mean, it's like deny till you die kind of mentality, right? Grammar documents that Joseph Smith was translating was essentially like a Egyptian to English dictionary. That's what it was for. And the essay says, while acknowledging that the documents exist, that their function is ambiguous. So the third sort of attempt that the essay makes to work around is the redefinition of translation. It doesn't explicitly make the argument, and that's kind of the point. You just create room for a redefinition of translation by what you don't say. You don't define what Joseph meant by translation, like I said, because Joseph clearly thought he was translating from Egyptian to English. Okay, so you don't note that the eyewitness accounts existed of this happening. You don't say that the Times and Seasons publication called it a translation. The heading in your scriptures call it a translation. The word applied to the Book of Abraham everywhere in the historical record used by Joseph and his scribes and the church for 180 years is translation. But in your essay, you just avoid saying what translation is. You just don't challenge any of that. You just don't define the word.
They don't do any of that, but then conclude, and I'll quote it, "The veracity and value of the Book of Abraham cannot be settled by scholarly debate concerning the book's translation and historicity." End quote.
Absolutely.
What?
And not just that, Jess. The essay doesn't just end like that. It actually begins and ends in the same way. So it starts by saying, the Book of Abraham's status as scripture ultimately rests on faith. And then, as you said, it ends by saying, the truth of the Book of Abraham is ultimately found through careful study of its teachings, sincere prayer, and the confirmation of the Spirit. So faith. So it opens and closes with, scholarly debate can't settle this, pray about it, but we're going to fill this essay with scholarly arguments anyway that don't hold water. Okay, tells you right there, nothing you read was going to ever help you reach a conclusion. In situations like this, the church retreats into an unfalsifiable position, and then it tries to claim evidentiary wins. It's like, if evidence doesn't matter, then stop doing so much work to try and get evidence.
And so, just to be clear, to pull back a little bit, the essay exists because people were leaving the church. The church's own internal research, the Faith Crisis Report commissioned around 2013, found members were encountering this material online, like Hannah, and walking out. Church historian Stephen Snow said the essays were designed to reach those who were struggling with some of these issues. That's a direct quote. And that the church was losing young people particularly. Also a quote. The Book of Abraham essay was published in July 2014 after 8 other essays had already gone up, because it was the one they had been sitting on the longest. The Book of Abraham doesn't sit alone. If translation means revelation triggered by an object, that applies to the Book of Mormon too. The hat, the stone, the plates frequently not present, the same argument covers both. And if it covers both, then both texts are in the same position. Their connection to the ancient sources Joseph claimed to be rendering is unverifiable, because the method he used did not require him to engage with those sources at all.
The Kinderhook plates sit in the same category, and actually the Kinderhook plates were another one of those tabs on that website. It wasn't one of the 10 problems with Mormonism, but it was a little subshoot, and so I learned about them at the same time. That in April 1843, 6 brass plates were dug up from a burial mound in Kinderhook, Illinois. They were covered with these engraved symbols, just like the golden plates. And then naturally, you would think with all these burial mounds and plates hidden all over the countryside, somebody thought to take them to Joseph. In Nauvoo, his secretary, William Clayton, recorded in his journal that Joseph translated a portion of them. The person buried with the plates said that he was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So unoriginal. They're so unoriginal. Ah, damn, they don't have an original thought in their head, these narcissists. You could pick anything. You know you're making this up, right? Get an imagination. The limits of their imagination is the most offensive thing of all of their lying, frankly. Yeah, so this fucker is the descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh. Oh my God, it's offensive. So the Times and Seasons promised that a full translation would be on its way as soon as it was complete. Unfortunately, I don't think that ever happened, because the plates were a contemporary to Joseph Smith hoax. So 3 men from Kinderhook had made them. They cut out the brass, and then they kind of try and aged it, and then they used acid to etch the symbols into it. And the design was to test whether Joseph would be able to translate them as he claimed. And sure enough, he did. So I think that told them everything they needed to know about Joseph's truth claims as a prophet. The church defended them as authentic until 1981, when they had no choice but to acknowledge that scientific testing confirmed that they were modern. The church's current page on Kinderhook currently argues that Joseph wasn't attempting an actual revelatory translation process. No. Make no mistake, it was just a scholarly comparison. Peyton's journal says he translated a portion, okay? So just let it go. God, why are you so angry?
So many reasons. So many reasons. More examples here of what's wrong, of how this process is so messed up. So let's talk about Zelf. In June 1834, Joseph was leading a march through Illinois with a group called Zion's Camp. They came across a burial mound near the Illinois River and dug into it. What does this group have? They are obsessed with burial mounds. So they dig into this burial mound and find a skeleton with an arrowhead between the ribs. And Joseph identified the person by vision. His name was Zelf. He was a white Lamanite, a warrior and chieftain under the great prophet Onondagas, known from Cumorah to the Rocky Mountains. Whoa, pretty important dude, right? 7 members of Zion's Camp recorded versions of this. In a letter to Emma the following day, Joseph described their party wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, picking up their skulls and their bones as a proof of its divine authenticity. The mound has since been archaeologically dated to the Hopewell culture, somewhere between 100 BC and 500 AD. The church doesn't teach this one. The geography model, which places Book of Mormon events in a small region of Central America, doesn't have a good home for a Lamanite warrior chieftain in the Illinois River Valley.
So the Book of Abraham is just one in a line of Joseph Smith's hoax translations. It's a clear case of this because we have the surviving facsimile with Joseph's published labels and how he translated these images, and a fully developed scholarly field. And they can sit in juxtaposition one to another. The Kinderhook plates were a hoax with no ancient content to evaluate. Obviously, they were just acid etchings. Zelf was a vision with no physical artifact remaining, but the Book of Abraham is a physical document, a claim translation, and a testable mismatch. And that's why it has an essay on the church's website.
Richard Bushman, Rough Stone Rolling, said publicly, "The dominant narrative is not true. It can't be sustained. The church has to absorb all this new information or it will be on very shaky grounds." And that was a direct quote.
Yeah, from an LDS historian.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of LDS employed scholars, Egyptologists have been essentially unanimous for over a century that the Book of Abraham Papyri are ordinary funerary texts unrelated to Abraham. So what is the church going to do with that? Well, what they can't do is present the conclusions that follow from the evidence. So they offer implausible workarounds. Then they step back and say the question isn't answerable by the means that it just spent thousands of words applying to it. As I said, is hilarious in just how sort of transparently obvious it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so deeply sad as well, when you kind of sit with the grief of the reality of what that means. This is a way to avoid reality. And it just made me really think about my parents differently, because it was like, if people I know and love can know this stuff and still just choose to ignore it, well, what does that say about how I was raised? And you can call it cognitive dissonance, but that doesn't even feel strong enough. There's nothing the church could do or say that would stop my parents believing.
I think for me, Hannah, as you were talking, I was thinking about this woman who reached out for coaching and was saying, what does this mean? What does this mean if it's not true? Does it mean I don't get to be with my family in heaven? Does it mean I don't get to see the sister that I lost? And that, I think, for me, is one of the most offensive parts of all of this. So many people, were they informed of the truth from the get-go, if they had been told there were, seer stone and a hat in terms of the translation of the Book of Mormon, if they were told that the pearl of great price and these foundational texts of their religion was something revealed, not translated from found papyri, would they have ever committed in the way that they did through their
Hmm.
tithing, through their callings, through their prayer, through
Right.
their commitment to the community? I don't think they would have. And I think at its core, the church understands that. And that's why these essays sit where they do on the website. That's why they weren't touted from the pulpit at General Conference. That's why they were just quietly published and left there, because they knew they had to respond to what was available on the internet.
Yeah.
But the risk of informing this faithful populace and losing all of those members, losing all of those tithing funds, losing all of that free labor, that was too great. So they're trying to like thread the needle by putting the information out there, but leaving it out of sight.
Yeah, and like you said, it just like leaves people saying, then I wasn't given informed consent. Like
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't given informed choice. I was making a choice to live according to the edicts of this religion, but you did not give me full information
Right.
back about what you're up to. Sorry to make such a lazy metaphor, but if you find out that your partner's been cheating on you for the last 20 years, you're going to think about those 20 years and go, you know what? I'd love to have known so I could make a choice about whether or not I
Right.
wanted to keep doing this instead of just being in this without all the information that I would need in order to make that choice. Give me all the information I need to make the choice. You don't decide how much I need. That's the other offensive thing the church does. Well, not all information is useful. I'll be the judge of that.
Right. And by the time you do get the information, your sunk costs are so great that many people are unwilling to look any closer because they have too big of a commitment. And so when a member reads the essay and arrives at the end of it, they're not left in silence. They're given an institutional answer that it's consistent across every gospel topic essay. Pray, seek personal revelation, trust that the faith is not contingent on resolution. And so the essay tells you exactly what to do with this unresolved question and the enormity of what you've just learned. Tuck it on the shelf. Keep attending, keep sustaining. The institution has a place for your uncertainty, and that place is inside the church.
Yeah, the church is not going to be able to resolve any uncertainty or offer any answers to serious questions, but it will tell you to not believe your own lying eyes. And honestly, one reason this topic gets so charged is because it's not a disagreement about ancient papyrus. It's about authority and epistemology. How do I know what I know? How can I be trusted to know what I know? If an institution repeatedly teaches people to subordinate direct evidence, outside expertise, historical contradiction, and your own internal alarm bells to their improved interpretation, now some people can hold on to that and experience that as like faith negotiation. And then other people will experience that as systematic psychological manipulation, telling you to not believe the evidence in front of your own eyes.
And when you look, this is codified, right? The Come Follow Me lesson on Abraham 3 doesn't mention the papyri. It doesn't mention the essay. The catalyst theory isn't in the lesson. The lesson just has the doctrine. The workaround lives in a gospel topics essay that members are not directed to, and that correlation has not been put in the curriculum.
This is one of those issues where the evidence isn't close. The only question that remains is what you do with it, and that is up to each of us to answer.
In the next episode, we look at the race and the priesthood essay, like what the church now says about why Black members were excluded from temple ordinances and the priesthood for 126 years, who the church says made that decision, and what it means for the doctrine of continuous revelation that they're now saying it was a mistake.
We so appreciate you listening. Thank you for sharing, liking, subscribing, and rating. 5 stars, of course. Thank you. We appreciate it.
We do. And if you want to support the podcast, please go over to Buy Me a Coffee. This takes a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of analysis, and your support means everything to us and helps keep the podcast going. Before we go, I want to just give a shout out to the folks that make us sound more polished and professional, to Hannah W. for our amazing lyrics on our theme song, to Dr. Dave for the extra guitar.
And as Jess said, for just the price of 1 cup of coffee a month, you could support us, which we would be so eternally grateful for. And Jess, before we go, I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
Hannah, I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon too.